Dr. Evelyn Hart, a renowned neuroscientist and billionaire, her face pale and expressionless. Her only son, Ethan, lay in the coffin before her, his life cut short at just 22 years old. Ethan had been declared dead after a tragic car accident a week earlier. The doctors had tried everything to save him, but his injuries were too severe. Evelyn, however, refused to accept it. She had spent her life studying the human brain, pushing the boundaries of science, and she couldn't let her son go without one last attempt to understand what had happened. As the priest delivered the eulogy, Evelyn's mind raced. Hidden inside Ethan's coffin was a small, high-tech camera she had secretly installed. It wasn't just any camera, it was part of an experimental project she had been working on for years, designed to monitor brain activity in near-death states. She had never tested it on a human before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. She needed to know if there was even the slightest chance Ethan's brain had shown signs of life before he was buried. The mourners began to leave, but Evelyn stayed behind, her assistant, Mark, by her side. Mark was the only one who knew about the camera. He had helped her install it the night before, and now he held a tablet, ready to activate the device. "Do you really think this will work?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Evelyn replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I have to try." With a deep breath, she nodded, and Mark tapped the screen. The camera came to life, transmitting a live feed to the tablet. At first, the screen showed nothing but darkness. Then, as the camera adjusted to the low light, the interior of the coffin came into view. Ethan's lifeless body lay there, his face peaceful but pale. Evelyn's heart ached as she stared at the image. But then something happened. The camera's sensors detected a faint signal, a flicker of brain activity. Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mark, do you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Before Mark could respond, the screen flickered again. This time, Ethan's hand twitched. Then his eyes fluttered open. Evelyn screamed. Evelyn's scream echoed through the empty cemetery, startling Mark so much that he nearly dropped the tablet. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen, where Ethan's eyes were now wide open, blinking slowly as if trying to adjust to the darkness of the coffin. "Ethan! Ethan!" Evelyn cried, her voice breaking. She grabbed the tablet from Mark, her fingers shaking as she zoomed in on her son's face. "He's alive! Oh my God, he's alive!" Mark's face turned pale. "But how?" "The doctor said he was gone. They confirmed it." Evelyn didn't answer. Her mind was racing. She had spent years researching near-death experiences, studying the thin line between life and death. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Her son, whom she had mourned for days, was alive, trapped in a coffin 6 feet underground. "We have to get him out," Evelyn shouted, her voice frantic. "Now, Mark, call for help. Get the cemetery workers, call an ambulance, do something." Mark fumbled with his phone, his hands still shaking as he dialed emergency services. Evelyn, meanwhile, dropped to her knees beside the grave, clutching the tablet. She could see Ethan's lips moving as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came through the camera's audio feed. "Hold on, Ethan, hold on," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "We're coming for you." Minutes felt like hours as they waited for help to arrive. Evelyn's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, fear. How could this have happened? How could the doctors have been so wrong? And why had she waited until now to activate the camera? The thought that her son had been buried alive made her stomach churn. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the air. A team of paramedics and cemetery workers rushed to the scene, their faces a mix of confusion and urgency. Evelyn quickly explained the situation, showing them the live feed from the camera. The workers wasted no time. They grabbed shovels and began digging, their movements frantic but precise. Evelyn stood back, clutching the tablet, her eyes glued to the screen. Ethan's movements were becoming more pronounced now. He was clearly conscious, his eyes darting around the confined space of the coffin. Evelyn could see the panic in his expression, and it broke her heart. "Faster!" she screamed at the workers. "Please, hurry!" As the dirt was cleared away and the coffin lid came into view, Evelyn felt a surge of hope. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by a chilling thought. If Ethan was alive, what did that mean for the accident? And why had he been declared dead in the first place? The cemetery workers pried open the coffin lid with crowbars, the sound of metal scraping against wood piercing the tense silence. Evelyn stood just a few feet away, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment the lid was lifted, she rushed forward, her eyes locking onto Ethan's pale, trembling form. "Ethan!" she cried, reaching for him. His skin was cold, his body weak, but he was alive. His eyes met hers, filled with confusion and fear. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse and barely audible. "Mom," he managed to whisper, his voice cracking. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she helped the paramedics lift him out of the coffin. They quickly wrapped him in blankets and placed him on a stretcher, rushing him to the waiting ambulance. Evelyn climbed in beside him, holding his hand tightly as the vehicle sped toward the hospital. The ride was a blur. Evelyn couldn't take her eyes off Ethan, who drifted in and out of consciousness. She kept replaying the events in her mind, the funeral, the camera, the moment she saw him open his eyes. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, but at the same time, she was overwhelmed with relief that he was alive. When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan was immediately taken into the emergency room. Evelyn was forced to wait outside, pacing the hallway as doctors and nurses rushed in and out. Mark joined her shortly after, his face pale and drawn. "How is he?" Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. "I don't know," Evelyn replied, her voice trembling. "They're running tests, but he was conscious, Mark. He spoke to me. He's alive." Mark nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Evelyn, this doesn't make sense. How could the doctors have been so wrong? They declared him dead. They ran tests. How could he have survived?" Evelyn shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Someone made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake, and I'm going to make sure they answer for it." As the hours passed, Evelyn's anxiety grew. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his face serious but calm. "Dr. Hart," he began, "your son is stable. He's weak and dehydrated, but he's going to be okay. We're running more tests to understand what happened, but this is a miracle." Evelyn let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "He's resting now, but you can sit with him. He's been asking for you." Evelyn followed the doctor to Ethan's room, her heart swelling with relief as she saw him lying in the hospital bed, his eyes half open. He looked exhausted, but he managed a weak smile when he saw her. "Mom," he whispered. "I'm here, Ethan," she said, taking his hand. "I'm here." Ethan's smile faded and his expression grew serious. "Mom, I need to tell you something. About the accident. It wasn't an accident." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone tried to kill me." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as Ethan's words hung in the air. She leaned closer, her grip tightening on his hand. "What do you mean, someone tried to kill you? Ethan, tell me everything." Ethan took a deep breath, his voice weak but determined. "The night of the accident. I was driving home from the lab. I remember seeing headlights behind me, but they were too close. I tried to speed up, but the car, it rammed into me. It wasn't an accident, Mom. They hit me on purpose." Evelyn's mind raced. She had assumed the crash was just that, a tragic accident. But if Ethan was right, if someone had intentionally caused it, then this was something far more sinister. "Did you see who was driving the other car?" she asked urgently. Ethan shook his head weakly. "No, it all happened so fast. But I remember something else. Before the crash, I overheard a conversation at the lab. Two people were arguing about the project I was working on. They sounded angry. One of them said something like, 'If he finds out, we're all in trouble.'" Evelyn's stomach churned. Ethan had been working on a groundbreaking project at her research facility, a project that could revolutionize the field of neuroscience. It was highly confidential, and only a handful of people had access to the details. If someone had tried to silence Ethan to protect the project, it meant there was corruption within her own team. "Do you remember who was arguing?" Evelyn pressed gently. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to recall. I think one of them was Dr. Carter, but I'm not sure about the other voice. It was muffled. Dr. Carter. Evelyn's jaw tightened. He was one of her senior researchers, a man she had trusted for years. If he was involved in this, it would be a devastating betrayal. "Ethan, listen to me," Evelyn said, her voice firm but gentle. "You're safe now. I'm going to find out who did this to you, and I'm going to make sure they pay. But for now, you need to rest. Focus on getting better, okay?" Ethan nodded weakly, his eyes already closing as exhaustion took over. Evelyn stayed by his side for a while, watching him sleep, her mind racing with questions and suspicions. Finally, she stepped out of the room and found Mark waiting in the hallway. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Ethan just told me something. Something that changes everything." Evelyn and Mark found a quiet corner in the hospital hallway, away from prying ears. Evelyn quickly filled Mark in on what Ethan had told her, about the intentional crash, the argument at the lab, and Dr. Carter's possible involvement. Mark's face grew pale as he listened, his usual calm demeanor replaced by shock and concern. This is huge," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "If someone tried to kill Ethan to cover up something at the lab, it means there's a lot more going on than we realized. But why? What could be so important that they go to such extremes?" "That's what we need to find out," Evelyn said, her voice steely. "I need you to go back to the lab and start digging. Look into Dr. Carter's recent activities, his communications, anything that might give us a clue. But be careful. If he's involved, he's dangerous. Don't let him suspect anything." Mark nodded. "What about you?" "I'm going to stay with Ethan for now," Evelyn replied. "But I'll start looking into the accident. The police report, the witnesses, the other driver. There has to be something they missed. Someone out there knows what really happened, and I'm going to find them." As Mark left to begin his investigation, Evelyn returned to Ethan's room. He was still asleep, his breathing steady but shallow. She sat by his bedside, her mind racing. The thought that someone she had trusted, someone she had worked with for years, could be capable of such a heinous act was almost too much to bear. But she couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not when Ethan's life might still be in danger. The next few hours passed in a blur. Evelyn made calls, reviewed documents, and reached out to contacts in law enforcement. She learned that the other vehicle involved in the crash had never been found, and the police had closed the case, assuming it was a hit and run. But Evelyn wasn't satisfied. She knew there was more to the story. Late that evening, Mark called. His voice was tense, urgent. "Evelyn, you need to come to the lab. Now I found something big." Evelyn rushed to the lab, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The facility was eerily quiet at this hour, with only a few security lights casting long shadows across the hallways. Mark was waiting for her in her office, his face pale and his hands clutching a stack of documents. "What did you find?" Evelyn asked, closing the door behind her. Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her the documents, his hands trembling slightly. Evelyn quickly scanned through them, emails, financial records, and project reports. As she read, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Dr. Carter. He's been funneling funds from the project," Mark said, his voice low. "But it's not just about money. Look at this." He pointed to a series of emails between Carter and an unknown recipient. The messages were cryptic, but one phrase stood out. "Ethan knows too much. Handle it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "This is proof," she whispered. "Proof that Carter was involved in the crash. But why? What does Ethan know that's worth killing for?" Mark hesitated, then pulled out another document, a confidential project file that Ethan had been working on. "I think it's this," he said. Ethan was developing a new neural interface technology, something that could revolutionize how we treat brain injuries. But according to these records, Carter was secretly working on a competing project, one that would use the same technology for unethical purposes. Evelyn's stomach churned as she read through the file. Carter's project involved using the neural interface to manipulate brain activity, potentially controlling thoughts and behaviors. It was a horrifying violation of everything Evelyn stood for as a scientist. "This is why Ethan was a threat," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with anger. "He must have discovered what Carter was doing, and instead of exposing him, Carter tried to silence him permanently." Mark nodded grimly. "We need to take this to the authorities. But we have to be careful. If Carter finds out we know, he'll come after us too." Evelyn clenched her fists, her mind racing. "We can't wait. We need to confront him. Now. Before he has a chance to cover his tracks." Evelyn and Mark wasted no time. They knew they had to act quickly before Dr. Carter could suspect anything. With the evidence in hand, they made their way to his office, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways of the lab. The tension was palpable, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that could change everything. When they reached Carter's office, the door was slightly ajar. Evelyn pushed it open, her heart pounding. Carter was seated at his desk, his back to them as he stared at his computer screen. He turned sharply when he heard the door creak, his eyes narrowing as he saw Evelyn and Mark standing there. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm but guarded. "What are you doing here so late?" Evelyn stepped inside, holding up the documents Mark had found. "We know, Carter. We know everything." For a moment, Carter's face went pale, but he quickly recovered, forcing a smile. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Evelyn snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "The emails, the financial records, the project files, we have it all. You tried to kill my son to cover up your unethical experiments. How could you? How could you betray everything we stand for?" Carter's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with defiance. "You always were too idealistic, Evelyn. You think science is about helping people, about making the world a better place. But the real world doesn't work that way. There's power in control. Power that people will pay anything for. I was going to change the game, and Ethan, he was in the way." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. "You're a monster." Carter shrugged. "Maybe. But I'm a monster who's going to win. Do you really think you can stop me? You have no proof that ties me directly to the crash. And even if you did, who's going to believe you? I've covered my tracks too well." Before Evelyn could respond, Mark stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Actually, we have more than proof. I've been recording this entire conversation, and the authorities are on their way." Carter's smug expression faltered. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you're so clever," he snarled. "But you're too late. By the time the police get here, I'll be long gone." He lunged toward the door, but Evelyn moved quickly, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You're going to pay for what you've done." For a moment, Carter looked like he might try to push past her, but then he hesitated. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Carter's shoulders slumped, and he let out a bitter laugh. "You win, Evelyn, but this isn't over, not by a long shot." The police arrived moments later, arresting Carter on the spot. As he was led away in handcuffs, Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't just about bringing Carter to justice, it was about protecting Ethan, about ensuring that no one else would suffer because of Carter's greed and ambition. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn focused on rebuilding her life and her relationship with Ethan. He made a full recovery, his strength and spirit returning day by day. Together, they decided to continue his neural interface project, but this time, with a renewed commitment to ethics and transparency. The scandal surrounding Carter's actions rocked the scientific community, but it also served as a wake-up call. Evelyn used her platform to advocate for stricter regulations and greater accountability in research, ensuring that no one could exploit science for personal gain. As for Ethan, he emerged from the ordeal stronger and more determined than ever. He had faced death and survived, and now he was ready to make the most of his second chance. He and Evelyn grew closer, their bond stronger than ever as they worked side by side to make a difference in the world. The story of the camera and the coffin became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there is always a chance for redemption. And for Evelyn and Ethan, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, purpose, and the promise of a brighter future.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.